Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is, of course, by tradition, this is the death slot, where we all ingest our lunch and very, very, very slowly go to sleep. You will not do that in this next hour, that I absolutely promise. We've got two great speakers, I think, continuing a wonderful tour d'horizon that we had this morning, and of course an absolutely inimitable address from Lord Heseltine. Two great speakers, starting with our first speaker, Steve Goldsmith. Steve is the Daniel Paul Professor of Government at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's got a terrific blend, which I hugely personally appreciate, of experience as an academic, but also as a practitioner. In '91, Steve ran for mayor of Indianapolis under the Republican banner. He won his term there by a clear majority. He served as mayor of Indianapolis for 2 terms up until 2000, 1992 to 2000. And in fact, one of his US academic colleagues concluded that he and Mayors William Hudnut and Richard Lugar between them attracted more than $3 billion in new investment to the city over that 25-year period. Steve was Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to President George W. Bush in the 2000 campaign, and he then served as a special advisor to the President on faith-based and not-for-profit initiatives. He was appointed chair of the Board of Directors for the Corporation for National and Community Service in 2001, which is a position he still holds. In 2010, Michael Bloomberg actually asked if he could appoint Steve to become Deputy Mayor for Operations. So he has responsibility there, or had responsibility there, for police, fire, sanitation, and buildings, with pretty substantial brief by anybody's reckoning. And he was also tasked by Michael Bloomberg with advancing an innovation agenda in the city, and his work led to enhancements in the city's use of technology and indeed faster processing of building permits, which I think those of us who've listened to the whole of this morning will agree is one of the hot topics. On top of all that, he's the Chairman Emeritus of the Manhattan Institute Center for Civic Innovation, and if that isn't a CV, I don't know what is. Please welcome Steve Goldsmith.
Thank you for most of the introduction. The part about you will now go to sleep during the next 2 speakers I found a bit offensive, but the rest of it was quite enjoyable. Thank you. You're dealing today and in this session with important issues of economic development for cities in various situations. My presentation, though, is really aimed at kind of the functioning of government, not the exciting business attraction or the complicated issues of housing, but basically how one runs government. And it seems to me, I've been in local government for several decades, that all of these other issues are important and interesting, but if the city doesn't pick up the trash well and fight crime well and make the infrastructure work, that all of the conversation about economic development becomes somewhat irrelevant. So I just want to talk a little bit about how one would think about providing high-quality services with ever-increasing demands and less money to do so, which is kind of a worldwide phenomena both in the U.S. and in the U.K. A couple of things just to think about. One is that just maybe easily thought about this way. Government is organized vertically, right? We work in agencies. We have a transportation department, economic development department, a housing department. But people don't live that way. They live horizontally, right? They live in a community. And so we've organized government almost in an unresponsive way to the way people live today, because they live in these systems. And then we have government that is increasingly being provided not just through government officials, but through private sector partners as well. So how do we manage that network of government resources in order to produce results? Now, I think a lot about the responsive government, and my introduction mentioned building permits in New York City. So if you're a citizen of London or New York City or Indianapolis, Indiana, and you want to transact with government, you have to transact with government on government's terms, not on your terms, right? So this is a citizen looking up at this kind of array of kind of agencies, and you can shop your building permits across, or shop your restaurant permits across, or get the services you want, so long as you have the stamina to get through the system before you kind of run out. In New York City, at least when I started, the way we issued restaurant permits is, you went through 14 agencies, and you got your restaurant permit just about the time that if you were a small business person, you ran out of capital, right? So we just kind of timed it perfectly so we would exhaust either you or your capital at the end of it. Now, this is how government should look, right? With a citizen-centered person, a citizen-centered system, where the organization of these efforts and the organization of government is responsive to the individual. Now, I don't want to go through these in great detail, but let's talk for a little while about the principles of responsive government, and I'll take each one of these just for a second. Now, this seems obvious, but in much of my work, even in a performance-driven government like the one that Mike Bloomberg ran, there's a tendency to measure activities, right? How fast do you do something? This slide is made up a conversation I had with a friend of mine who used to be mayor of Washington, D.C. And we talk a lot about public value, right? The purpose of public officials is to produce public value. And so you say, okay, what is public value? And this is a situation with a public hospital. Most major U.S. cities have public hospitals. Mayor Williams brought his group together and said, okay, how do we define value? And the health officials said, we're going to run the best public hospital in the country. We're going to have the lowest cost of service in the country, et cetera. And he said, that's really not the definition of public value. The definition of public value is public health, right? Public hospital may be a way to reach public health. It may not be a way to reach public health. And redesigned the medical community health system in Washington, D.C., which one was more distributed with a number of community health clinics that intervened earlier. Now, you could do this exercise across any area. And inevitably, I found that we are spending a lot more time measuring activities than we are outcomes. Deputy Mayor of New York City, when I was Deputy Mayor of Operations, Deputy Mayor of Social Services, a terrific woman named Linda Gibbs. She did this exercise with her homeless services, right? She was the head of the homeless department. They reported her. She got the officials around and said, what are we trying to do? And they said, we're trying to provide shelters for those who are homeless. And she looked around and says, is that really the definition of public value? That's my definition, she said, of failure. The definition of public value is when we prevent people from becoming homeless. Now, if we have to provide shelters, we have to provide shelters, but the absence of a clear-cut definition, excuse me, obviously drives response to the wrong place. Now, in the UK and US, around the world now, we're seeing an enormous change in effectiveness through data-driven government. And it's hard to kind of believe how much in the last 3 years or 4 years or even a year that the technology tools have changed. And we have an array of these tools, and everybody in the room knows each one of these, but when you see them listed and you realize how much things have changed, right? I was sitting next to, my job for Mayor Bloomberg was innovation, and we work in an open room like this with no offices, and I turned around one day and said, I've got the best innovation idea I've ever had. He said, what is it? And I said, we're going to eliminate paper. Right? And he said, he kind of looked at me like, is this really the best you can come up with? But the point was, if we remove these paper-based systems and we create digital systems, and we unlock all sorts of opportunity in terms of efficiency and analytics. Social networking lets us communicate with our residents in a much more effective way. Handheld devices, obviously, in the field allow workers not only to have more information, but more decision support systems. We have digital warehouses and performance metrics. And then increasingly, the transparency movement, the open data movement, not only allows for individuals to hold their government more accountable, it allows for them to build on government data to produce solutions to important problems. Those technology building blocks will produce the ability to use data analytics. So let me just use an example of this. So one day when I was deputy mayor of New York, a family died, a family of 5 died in a fire. And it was a fire in one of those buildings that had been illegally converted to multiple apartments, right? And no permits or anything, and the building burned down. And I kind of anticipated what was going to happen, that the New York Daily News or Post was going to call and asked, so I called the buildings department and said, "Do you ever received a complaint about that building?" And they said, "Yeah, to kind of get off our backs, we get 30,000 complaints a year, and we're working through that list." And they called the fire department, so we got 50,000 complaints a year, and we're working through the list, and what else do you expect us to do? Then we took a group of kind of data scientists that were in City Hall and said, there must be a better way to do this. And so they took foreclosure information, tax delinquency information, reports for law enforcement responses, and 6 other easily attributable databases, and increased by 1,000% the prediction of which of those 30 to 50,000 were going to burn down, right? And then we took those 300 buildings, we sent a team in to mitigate the problems in those buildings. So think about the way government operates today. It operates mechanically, mechanistically, right? Everything is the same. That's the definition of red tape. But in a digital system, we can actually preempt those problems. We can figure out which child's going to get beat up next, where the next crime's going to occur, where the next fire's going to occur. It's a massively different way of operating cities and will allow us to drive resources where they're most needed. More New York City examples we'll come back to if we have time. Now, let's talk about a couple other issues. So I would hypothesize that one way to build a great city, even from a struggling position, is to have a city that's known for being responsive. Not just responsive in how it issues permits, but responsive in how it responds to its citizens. This is a map chart from the current mayor of Washington, D.C., who said, I'm going to hold my public officials responsible for how they treat the citizens of my city. So he created a scorecard, and when people leave the motor vehicles branch, they tweet back what their experiences were with this person or this branch. He then mines the social media, looking for language about not only the tweets that come back or other social media, but mines the social media, establishes a grade for each department, and when he has his weekly performance meetings with his cabinet ministers, if you will, he measures them, and these B's and B's and B minuses started as C's and D's. Right, the message here is, so if you listen to your citizens and if you hold your public officials responsible for the scoring, then the scores will go up. If you listen to your citizens and don't hold people accountable, obviously it won't make any difference. And this is the Great DC Scorecard, which is online if any of you want to see it. So I'm looking now really at kind of what is the definition of responsiveness. It's the intersection between big data, enterprise data, and social media, and in the center, right, is public value. And it helps, the fine print probably here is not worth a lot of detail, particularly given the time, but this is, many of you know that New York City and Manhattan Institute had a lot to do with this. New York City years ago started becoming safer when Bill Bratton started what he called a STAT program, right, holding precinct commanders responsible by statistics of what's happening in their precincts. This STAT measurement program, now combined with data analytics, is the way that performance is driven across a range of city activities. Now, just a couple other principles, and then you can get on to the more exciting economic development discussion. But one way to think about governance, right, is that if one is, U.S. mayors obviously in many cities have more authority than they do in most UK cities, but whoever the leader is of the government should think about themselves as the arranger of a network of resources. In other words, it's a very limited view of the quality of your city to say, I'm just going to manage my bureaucrats better. And I don't even mean bureaucrats in a pejorative sense. I mean hard-working public officials, because the way that one creates quality is you say, what authority do I have? I have financial resources, I have legal authority, I have rhetorical authority, I have convening authority, and all of those things I can bring to bear through operating with NGOs, operating with the private sector, operating with individuals. And so this is just a chart to suggest that responsiveness for an elected official trying to create a great city is one where you activate this network intentionally to produce the resources across a scale. There are many, obviously, aspects of this. This is just a program in New York City where NGOs worked with the police department, probation department to keep people out of jail in an explicit partnership. They had some cultural differences since the NGO tried to keep people out of jail and the police tried to put them in jail. It was kind of it got off to a rocky start, but it was just to illustrate an issue. Let's talk for a minute about citizen-driven responsiveness. And in this situation, this is a call, NYC 311 is the call center in New York City. But the full benefits of open data are when you have not just a government that responds to a complaint, right, but a government that opens up all its data, shows where these citizen requests are coming from, shows how long it takes to solve them, and allows third parties to actually operate on them. And so this map, don't worry about the words, but there's a point here. So the size of, we got 20 million phone calls a year to 311 in New York City, right, request for service. We took those calls, and the size of the yellow dot represents how many calls were at that intersection. The larger the yellow dot, the more calls. Then we took some open data and some software, and we went around to our community boards and said, here's the map, and behind each one of these yellow things is what time of day we got the report, how long it took us to resolve the report, you know, what was the basis of that report, and opened up to the community groups not only how long did it take us to respond, but asked for their help in solving those problems. And so this is changing a call center to a platform for community engagement coupled with open data, and began to solve the problems that are behind those yellow dots. So, and this just makes the point that, you know, if we really want to have an open, transparent system, then we need to take budget information and allow our taxpayers to hold us responsible. And you know, opening up data, opening up our budgets in a way that nobody understands accomplishes very little. This chart, which is from Palo Alto, is designed to suggest that, and you can drill down inside each of these colors, but this is a way to visualize the budget of Palo Alto, California, right? So we've gone from kind of boring spreadsheets to Excel spreadsheets to open data till you can see boring Excel spreadsheets, right? To now kind of visualization that shows you the direction of the budget, by category allows residents to hold their citizens more responsible. Just lastly, if we want to engage citizens, this is the way that the residents of Boston now request city services, right? You take a picture on your iPhone or your Android, you have a GPS location, you have a picture of the problem, you send it to the city sends it to the city worker fixes it, sends back a picture of the fixed thing, it goes to the resident who made the complaint, it's tracked in real time. The one on the left shows how citizens connect, and the one on the right is just an example of a pothole request. The next iteration of this allows the city worker himself or herself to communicate directly back to the resident, because you know, there's a lot more work that goes on in cities than most residents realize, and so the connection gives both satisfaction on part of the public worker as well as to the resident themselves. So these are just examples of using data to create a responsive city. Third-party use. Chicago has asked residents to report when they have the flu, because they find out that citizen reports of the flu mapped on a GIS map provide warnings even faster than the doctors do, because obviously the information is there and available. So in the end, these are the building blocks of a responsive government: performance measurement and stat programs, integrated data systems, taking calls to 311 and making it a platform for engagement, looking at measuring outcomes and not merely inputs, mining the social media, and then coming up with platforms for innovation, responsive, effective, transparent governance. And then finally, I'd say that what we're observing in U.S. cities is that a specific office responsible for innovation, driving innovation across the bureaucracies, will produce value, and that somebody needs to own the innovation agenda, and when they do, there can be dramatic leaps in the quality of public services. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. We will pick up, I know, some questions on that, I'm sure, after our next presentation, which is from Henry Overman. Henry is Professor in Economic Geography at the LSE, and since September last year, the Director of the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. His current research interests include the clustering of economic activity, the evolution of cities, and the causes and consequences of urban sprawl. He's very distinguished in his field. In 2006, he was awarded the Auguste Loge Prize for Outstanding Research in the field of regional science. In 2009, he won the Geoffrey Hewings Award for Distinguished Contributions to Regional Science Research by scholars who've recently completed their doctoral studies. there's nobody better qualified, I think, anyway, in this context, to speak about London and indeed other cities and their issues. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Steve, for your thoughts. Actually, what I'm going to say dovetails quite well with what Steve was talking about. Now, Steve, I felt, was slightly apologetic about the fact that he was going to talk about the nitty-gritty of actually, how we deliver public services and how we improve them. And in some ways, what I want to do is argue that, in fact, this is incredibly important, and that we spend way too much of our time arguing about the big picture issues and nowhere near enough of our time discussing what on earth policy should do and how we make policy effective. Now, Steve picked up on this idea that, with good information, accountability, transparency, responsiveness, that sort of tied in with ICT is a crucial way of driving public service reform. He gave us a number of excellent examples of that. And I want to add to that this idea that we also need to be seeing far more experimentation and far more evaluation of whether, when we do experiment, it makes any difference to the people that we think that public services and public policy should be trying to help. Now, I want to tell you, as a way of sort of getting us to this, a little bit about how I've ended up here. So, from 2008 to 2013, I directed something called the Spatial Economics Research Centre. And the Spatial Economics Research Centre, or SERC, was one of these things that government and the research councils occasionally fund. It's 50-50 funded between research councils and government departments. One way of viewing this is that you get the best of both worlds, the other is that you're never going to make either side of the equation happen. The interesting thing about SERC was that it basically had a remit to try and get policymakers to use evidence in the formulation of policy. Okay? So I spent a huge amount of time trying to figure out, what that evidence base looked like, and translating stuff. Some of it you've heard this morning from Ed Glaser, for example. So I basically spent a lot of time saying, well, how does that stuff apply in Britain? How do we take those insights from the evidence base and how do we use them to improve urban policy? And I was particularly tasked with doing this in the area of economic growth. And when you do that kind of stuff, you go and you look at the literature and you look at Ed Glaser and the writings of urban economists from across the world, and you come up with a bunch of messages that you think should inform the development of urban policy. So here are some of those that I have gone around saying to people. So one of my messages is that it's quite clear in Britain that who you are is far more important than where you are for determining your life chances. Forget the north-south divide. The really big divide is between us and whichever way East London is. Okay? So that, there's sort of big message. It's important, and it is important for understanding what you're going to do, because, for example, if you want to understand why London is doing so well, what you really need to understand is that London is attracting people who would do well wherever they located in Britain. In other words, it's the positive sorting, it's the fact that the best people, or the most productive people, the people who are going to have the best labour market outcomes, etc., end up living in the best places. Okay? And then, you would go and you talk to policymakers about this, and you would urge caution on them, because, as you will have heard from Ed this morning, the market forces driving those best people into those best places are incredibly strong. And if you are fronted up with very strong market forces, you need very strong policy levers if you're going to counter those. And unfortunately, as the evidence shows, we spend a lot of our time pulling on policy levers that are incredibly ineffective. So one of the things that we constantly try and do is turn around places that aren't working. And so we basically work on the productivity side of places. We try to figure out, what is it about place X? I'll be careful given the experience Policy Exchange has with naming and shaming places that are struggling. What is it about place X that makes its productivity lower, and what can we do about it? And actually, it turns out that there is very little that we can do as policy makers and local decision makers when confronted with the fact that some places' economy is forming better than others. Not least because quite a lot of that better performance comes precisely because you've got intelligent, innovative people concentrated in some place, and that's something that's very, very hard to do. We do have very strong policy levers on costs, but ironically, as you will have heard this morning, we spend our time pulling these like crazy to stop people from being able to go to our more productive places and be involved with our more productive cities. And then you basically run this all together and you say, so look, really, what we're suggesting to you here is you want to focus far more on costs. You want to think about land use planning, permitting, commercial land supply. You probably need to think about building on success, not London on its own, but places, within broad regions. So, think about how do we get Manchester going? How do we get Leeds going? How do we get Newcastle going? So you say all of this, and you give policymakers all of this evidence base, you try to get them thinking about it in the application of policy, and then the buggers just go off and do whatever the hell they like. Okay? So, and there's a reason for this, which I think is perfectly acceptable, which is it turns out that policymakers have got to get on with delivering public services and doing stuff, and they also have to take account of politics in a way that people like me just do not have to. And this makes things very different. So, I've spent 6 years trying to do this, and now I've suddenly decided that I'm going to switch to the side that Steve and others are on, which is I'm just going to hold up my hands and say, you know what? Actually, instead of being upstream from policy, where what I'm trying to do is get these broad evidence bases to inform things, I'm going to shift downstream from policy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and look at the kind of policies that people are doing and try and figure out what on earth the impact of those policies are, and then feed that back in so that we can try and do more effective policy. So that is what the new thing that I do, the new What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth, is about. We've shifted. Now again, this is 50-50 funded. There's a thing there about governments and initiatives, which I shan't dwell on. But the big shift is being downstream from policy and thinking about the impact of it. And what we're particularly doing in that is trying to encourage people to focus on something Steve picked up on actually, which is that we spend far too much time monitoring activities, outputs, I like to think of them, right? And we spend far too little time thinking about outcomes. What is it that is different as a result of the policy intervention that we have put in place? And I think that two things are going to be crucial to this, one of which is evaluating the things that we're doing, and the other of which is experimenting about what we're doing. And I see these very much as complements to the kind of things that Steve was talking about. Now, I have a very particular focus on impact evaluations. What I really want to do is to be able to attribute to something that we are doing as policymakers that it's actually had some impact. And the way we go about this is through a kind of impact evaluation, which basically says, look, we've really got to go and look at the people who are the recipients of our largesse, or the recipients of some policy intervention that we're doing, regulation or whatever, and we have to see what happened to those people before the policy was in place, and compare it to what's happening after the policy is in place. But of course, lots of things are changing. Lots of things are changing in society all the time. So what we really need is a policy, is a set of people who we've left the hell alone, right? Some kind of control group for whom, we can see what would have happened in the absence of us doing anything to these people. So the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth tries to push this, tries to say, okay, look, when we really want to think about whether what we've done is effective, we want to take a before and after comparison for the people that we are interfering with, and we want to compare that to a control group of people that nothing has happened to. And that way we start to be able to figure out what the impact of our policy is. Now, when you go to policymakers and start doing this, central government, local government, you come up with lots and lots of objections. Objection number one, which I find possibly the most depressing, is we already do lots of evaluation. This is just not true. Government does lots and lots of things that it calls evaluations. It spends loads and loads of money on them, but they are nearly always about process, not about what policy has actually achieved. And I think that actually government ministers and local decision makers would be far better served if we stopped spending quite so much money on process evaluation and case studies, and we actually spent more time trying to tell them, well, look, minister or chief executive and local authority, what you're doing makes this difference, and try to be precise about it. Now, I'll give you a precise number on this. So we've just been doing a review of business advice. We do systematic reviews, is one of the things we do. We went out and found 700 studies that purported to provide policymakers with evaluation of the impact of business advice. Now, we spend billions of pounds on providing advice to business. I can tell you of the 700 we found for the OECD, 23 met that minimum standard of basically looking at the guys we've given advice to before and after we give them advice and comparing them to some people we haven't given advice to. 600 and whatever, I shan't do the maths. One of the things you learn when you're lecturing is never to do maths on the fly. 600 and something purport to tell us about the impact of these schemes, but actually they're case studies talking about how fantastic it was to get support from the government with all this money that was handed out to them. Or it's another bunch of people saying how disappointed they were not to get money from government. Okay? These things really tell us very little. Another thing you get is complaints which say, well, you can't evaluate spatial policy. This stuff works for drugs. It works when NICE comes along and does stuff around medical trials, but you can't do it for spatial policy. And you can. It requires us to be a little bit creative, but working with colleagues, I've done stuff where we look at the impact of shiny buildings, subsidised by government. Shiny buildings, subsidised by government, get full of tenants, do nothing for local employment. This is not surprising, as they are a supply-side solution to a demand-side problem. Enterprise zones, I shan't touch on it, but enterprise zones basically shift activity from one side of the enterprise zone boundary to the other. We can look at the impact of roads. Roads are very good for creating employment in particular areas and shifting it around the city, not so good for doing productivity. We can look at investment grants, etc., etc. So we can evaluate spatial policies. Here's another complaint. Local context is so important. Everywhere is different. You know, if everywhere was different, no evaluation is worthwhile. I mean, we should just scrap all evaluation that we do as government, save ourselves a fortune. We can take lessons from other places, yes, you know, context matters. Learning how things have worked elsewhere isn't everything, but it certainly is an improvement from having no idea how stuff has worked elsewhere and implementing stuff that may be bad, may be good, may be indifferent. Now, I have to say that one of the confusions with this is often people like me who push this evaluation stuff, we're seen as trying to get politicians to worry about whether a policy intervention works or doesn't work. And you know, anyone in the room who has interacted with policymakers, be they central or local government, will know that the last thing they really want to do is to be held accountable for whether or not the policy has had any impact. Okay? So instead, we're trying to shift things towards where Steve is. We're trying to shift things towards saying, okay, hold on, look, you guys are going to do business advice, whatever. But let's just at least try to think about what components of our business advice are actually more cost effective. Should we be doing light touch, where we're just referring to firms to an online service? Or should we be doing intensive brokerage, where we're getting in and dealing with these people? How do we figure out which of these two we should be doing? Well, maybe when people come through the door, we channel some of them light touch, we channel some of them intensive, we use Steve's techniques and great data, we figure out which of these two groups did better, and then we compare it to the costs. How many studies do that of the 700 that we talked about? One. Okay, of 700 do this kind of comparison. When you get down to something like, should we focus on basic bookkeeping skills, or strategy, or game plan, or leadership, we don't experiment on any of these dimensions. We get so-called experts basically just carrying on and assigning people to people, and this leads to ineffective public good provision. Now, of course, actually what's interesting, and where I'm very sympathetic with Steve, is that these arguments are really difficult. The kind of things we are talking about, both of us actually, about public service reform, are really difficult. And they're really difficult because most people want to argue about control of policy. Okay? Most people want to argue about that rather than what policy should actually do. You'll have heard it all this morning. I bet there have been a whole bunch of calls for more decentralisation to UK cities. My challenge on that is, what the hell are they going to do with it when we decentralise? I am a decentralist, actually. I mean, I just believe in it, I believe the arguments for it, but we want to know what it's going to achieve. I suppose the argument that we're making here is that we need multiple sorts of evidence to improve urban policy making. We need the high-level arguments around the broad things, around institutional structure. We need the day-to-day nitty-gritty that we've been talking about here. Yes, arguments about systems and process are important, but so, at the end of the day is what we do. Steve has already outlined some of the things that will lead to that, and I'm going to add two to it. Two things that will be vitally important for going forward. One of which is that we have to have far more experimentation, and with that we have to be accepting that some of this will fail. This is a very, very difficult thing. And when we do experiment, we have to learn from that experiment, evaluate what it is, carry on doing what works, and stop doing what doesn't. I'll stop there.
Very much. Thank you.